The front door slammed shut, and I watched Peter walk out, leaving me with my 3 grandkids. Still, I didn't move, the sting of betrayal sharp in the air. As I held my youngest, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. His choice to leave us behind, his absence now a permanent scar on our family. That's when the call came, 13 years later, and Peter's voice accused me of kidnapping the very children I had raised. The betrayal wasn't just his, it was mine too. And now, I had to fight for what was rightfully ours. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The smell of roasted chicken filled the room, mingling with the faint warmth from the oven. Jim Matthews, settled at the head of the dinner table, glanced around at the faces of his wife Karen and their 3 grandkids. The evening was meant to be simple, just a quiet family meal after a long day. The kids, laughing and talking about their school week, seemed happy. Jim allowed himself a brief moment of peace, the kind of peace that had become rare in his life since Peter had walked out. As Jim carved the chicken, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. His eyes flicked to Karen, who shot him a questioning glance. "Who could that be?" she muttered under her breath. Jim shrugged, the sense of unease creeping in despite the mundane setting. When the door swung open, Peter stood there, a shadow against the bright fall evening, his face hardened, tense. "Peter," Jim's voice caught for a moment. It had been years since they'd spoken in any meaningful way. Peter's eyes flickered over Jim, dismissive, yet full of something deeper, resentment, anger, bitterness. Karen stood quickly, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What are you doing here?" she asked, but the words didn't carry the warmth Jim knew she had intended. "I need to talk to him." Peter's voice was flat, devoid of warmth. He pushed past her, ignoring the startled looks from the kids. Jim's hand froze on the knife, his mind racing. Peter was back. No apologies, no explanation. Just this thick, suffocating tension. "Peter, not now," Jim said, his voice tight. "This isn't the time." He looked at Karen, then at the kids, trying to keep his composure. This wasn't the place for an argument. Not now, not after all this time. But Peter wasn't listening. His eyes locked onto Jim's, and there it was, the familiar bitterness, the weight of past resentments that hung like a dark cloud between them. "You think this is your family now?" Peter's voice was low, cutting. "You've been raising my kids for how long? And for what? To steal them from me?" Jim's heart skipped a beat, his grip tightening on the knife, though he knew it was just a symbol of everything slipping out of his control. The room seemed to close in on him, the noise of the kids fading into the background. His chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though he already knew. The words were like a knife, twisting into his side. "I didn't ask you to raise them," Peter sneered, his voice venomous. "You took them from me, Jim. You took my kids, and now you act like you're their father." His eyes burned with something unspoken, guilt, anger, or maybe just desperation. Jim felt a rush of heat in his chest, anger, betrayal, a mix of grief that had haunted him for years, now boiled over, raw and unfiltered. His mind raced. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a battlefield. Peter took a step forward, his words growing louder, more dangerous. "You know, Jim, the best gift you could give me right now is if you just died." The room froze. Jim's heart pounded, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. His mouth went dry. The words stung, deep and jagged, cutting into something fragile inside him. He stared at Peter, trying to make sense of the depth of venom in his son's voice. Was this really his son standing before him? A quiet sob broke the silence, and it was Karen, standing at the edge of the kitchen, her hand over her mouth, her eyes filled with confusion. Jim didn't know how to respond. He didn't know what to say to a son who had been so lost, so cruel. How had it come to this? Before he could say anything, Karen stepped forward, trying to bridge the growing gap between them. "Peter, please," she urged, her voice trembling. "This isn't the way. Let's talk about this." But Jim's frustration was louder than any calm words could reach. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping back against the floor, and his voice cracked through the tension. "You're right, Peter," he said, the words tumbling out with force before he could stop them. "I raised your kids better than you ever did." The words hit the air like a slap, and for a moment, Peter's expression faltered. His eyes shifted, a flicker of something deeper in them, but he quickly masked it with a sharp, dismissive laugh. He turned on his heel, storming toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. Jim stood frozen, his breath shallow. His words hung in the room like smoke. Had he gone too far? His chest felt tight with the weight of what he'd said, but there was no going back. The damage had been done. Karen stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Her voice was small, almost apologetic. "Jim, you didn't mean that." But Jim couldn't answer. His mind was spinning, trapped between anger and guilt. He had just set a line in the sand with his own son, a line he couldn't unwrite. The door slammed shut, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Jim's gaze lingered on the empty doorway, the hurt still throbbing in his chest. He hadn't meant for things to escalate this way, but Peter had pushed him to this edge. Now, he had no idea how to bridge the chasm that had just widened between them. "Did I go too far?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen didn't answer. Instead, she just stood beside him, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of how fragile their family had become. And in the back of Jim's mind, a quiet voice wondered, was there any way back from this? Jim sat in the darkness of his living room, the dim glow from the TV flickering in the corner. The night felt endless. He hadn't moved in hours, his thoughts a jumbled mess of anger, disbelief, and pain. Peter's words echoed through his mind, each one sharper than the last. "The best gift you could give me is if you just died." The venom in those words felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. He had never imagined that it would come to this. How had it all gone so wrong? What had happened to the son he once knew, the boy he'd raised and loved despite every mistake? Jim's jaw clenched as he thought about Peter's bitter face, his heart hardening with each passing minute. He couldn't shake the image of Peter storming out of the house, his words lingering like a poison in the air. "Jim?" Karen's voice broke through the silence, soft and tentative. She sat beside him on the couch, her hand finding his, but Jim didn't look at her. He couldn't, not yet. "I'm sorry, I don't know what to say." Karen's voice trembled slightly as she tried to reach him, but Jim could feel the distance growing between them, a gap that had been widening for years. The betrayal he felt wasn't just from Peter, it was from the situation they were in. Karen had tried to warn him, tried to smooth things over, but he had gone too far. Now, the fissures were starting to show. "I don't know what he wants from me anymore," Jim muttered, his voice low and rough. He wasn't talking to Karen. He was talking to himself, trying to understand what had happened to the man he'd spent years protecting, the man he had called his son. Karen squeezed his hand, but Jim pulled away, lost in his own anger and confusion. He stood up, pacing the small room, the weight of his guilt pressing harder with every step. I thought I was doing the right thing. I gave him everything, Karen, everything. And now this?" Karen stayed silent, her eyes brimming with concern. She had been trying to reach him all night, but Jim wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. Not when the wound was still too raw. The phone's sudden ring startled him, the harsh sound pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw Peter's name flashing in the dark. Jim stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to answer. The weight of everything, his son's anger, his own bitterness, hung between them, making every decision feel like a step in the wrong direction. Karen watched him, her face lined with worry, but Jim didn't move to pick up the phone. The anger still churned in his chest, a bitter, suffocating presence. How could Peter just call like nothing had happened? How could he expect Jim to open up after those words, after everything that had been said? The phone stopped ringing, but Jim's mind didn't quiet. He wondered briefly if Peter felt any of the same hurt. Was it just him, or had Peter really lost his way? The silence stretched long. broken only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then the phone rang again. This time, Jim picked it up. "Dad, it's Peter." His son's voice came through, tired but calm. "I'm sorry for what I said last night. I shouldn't have said that." Jim's grip on the phone tightened, his body tense. He could feel the apology, but it didn't reach him. Not yet. Not after everything. "Yeah?" Jim's voice came out cold, detached. His anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. Peter's words, the apology, seemed hollow, a bandage on a wound that had cut too deep. I know I messed up. I've been thinking about everything, and I realize how bad I was. But I need your help. There's this business opportunity, and Jim didn't let him finish. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You don't get to call me, apologize for a second, and then ask for help like everything's fine. That's not how this works." Peter fell silent on the other end of the line. Jim could hear him breathing, waiting, but he couldn't bring himself to soften. Not yet. Not after what had been said. "You're on your own, Peter," Jim continued, his voice quieter now, the exhaustion settling in. "I can't keep doing this. I've been trying to save you for too long, but I can't anymore." The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Jim waited for a response, but when it came, it was just Peter's soft, defeated sigh. "I understand," Peter whispered before the line went dead. Jim stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision had been made. He wouldn't help Peter anymore. Not unless his son could take responsibility for himself. It was the only way, he told himself, but the words didn't feel as certain as they should have. Lily's voice interrupted his thoughts as she texted him. "Grandpa, we need to talk. I'm worried about you, about what's going on with you and Dad. Please think about what you're doing." Jim sat down slowly, his fingers hovering over the phone. He stared at the message, feeling the weight of it. His granddaughter was right to be worried. Everyone was, but was he doing the right thing? Was pushing Peter away the solution, or was it the final push that would send his son over the edge? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered. The ache in his chest deepened as he realized there was no way back from where they had gone. Was it too late to fix this? It had been days since Peter had answered a single message or returned a call. Jim stared at the phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether to send another text. "Peter, we need to talk. I'm here if you want to fix this." It felt empty, like the silence that had taken root between them. He had sent messages, dozens of them, but Peter had left them unanswered. It wasn't just a refusal to engage. It was an absolute, deliberate silence that cut deeper than any argument ever could. The silence had started to feel like a small relief, a space where Jim didn't have to face the heat of Peter's anger or his own guilt for the things he had said. But even in the absence of Peter's bitter accusations, Jim couldn't escape the gnawing feeling in his chest. He had made a choice, hadn't he? He had cut Peter off, just as Peter had abandoned his family all those years ago. Yet, every time Jim thought about it, he found himself wondering if he had done the right thing. Was this really the best option for Peter, or for him? Or had he pushed his son too far, too quickly? "Jim, stop checking your phone," Karen's voice broke through his thoughts. She had been watching him in silence for the better part of an hour, knowing full well what was going on in his mind. Jim set the phone down on the table, almost ashamed. "I don't know what to do, Karen. I feel like I'm walking through a fog. I don't know if I made the right decision, and now, Peter won't even look at me." "I know." Karen's voice was soft, her own frustration growing under the surface. "But you can't keep enabling him. You've been there for him all this time, and what has he done with it? What's it going to take for him to see that?" Jim leaned back in his chair, looking at her, but it felt like they were speaking in different languages. He could hear the truth in her words, but the guilt still clung to him, heavy and relentless. What was the right thing here? Was it truly over? Could he ever undo the damage he had caused, even if he wanted to? The sound of the front door opening startled them both. Karen stood up quickly, her face softening when she saw it was Mark, Jim's old friend. Mark had been in the picture long before Peter had started to unravel. He was someone Jim trusted, someone who knew him in ways few others did. Jim, Karen, Mark said, his voice a low rumble, his presence filling the room with a kind of grounded certainty. He had seen Jim at his best and worst, and had been there for many of the moments Jim wished he could forget. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Jim nodded, feeling a small sense of relief at the idea of speaking with someone who wasn't caught up in the mess. He sat forward, trying to shake off the cloud of doubt that had settled over him. "Peter's not answering your calls, huh?" Mark asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. He had been tracking the tension between father and son from the outside for a while now. "No," Jim replied, his voice quiet. "He's gone silent. Not a word. I've tried everything." Mark leaned back against the wall, folding his arms. "You know, Jim, this might be the best thing that's happened in years." Jim looked up at him, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean by that?" Mark sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I mean, Peter's been running this show for far too long. Every time you try to help him, you just let him off the hook. And what happens? He gets worse. He gets entitled, angry, manipulative. His resentment grows, and you're left cleaning up the mess." Jim shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with Mark's bluntness, but there was something about it that hit home. "But what if I'm pushing him too far? What if I've gone too hard on him?" Mark's eyes softened, but his tone didn't change. "Peter has to face the consequences of his own actions, Jim. He's a grown man. You've been giving him a safety net for years, and he's been using it to avoid the real world. If you keep enabling him, you'll just be keeping him stuck in that cycle." Jim felt the weight of Mark's words sink in, and for the first time in a long while, the fog seemed to clear a little. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of the hope he'd been holding on to, that somehow, some way, Peter would come back. But Mark's words made sense. Maybe he wasn't doing Peter any favors by always stepping in. Still, a deep ache settled in his stomach. Was he really ready to give up on his son completely? That night, as Jim sat alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling of isolation creeping in. The house felt emptier without Peter's presence, but it wasn't just the absence of his son that stung. It was the deepening divide between them. Jim had thought that cutting Peter off would force him to grow up, to take responsibility, but now he wasn't so sure. The silence was beginning to feel permanent, like a chasm that couldn't be bridged. In the meantime, the reality of Peter's life was worsening. The calls and messages from his creditors continued, but Peter refused to ask anyone for help. Even as the financial strain weighed heavier on him, he remained silent, a stubborn refusal to admit he needed support. He was too proud, too broken, too angry to accept the hand that Jim had once offered. And now, Peter's choices seemed to be spiraling further, but there was nothing Jim could do to stop it. The silence between them, though deafening, held an uncomfortable power. And as Jim sat in the quiet of his own home, he realized the only certainty now was that things were changing. But he couldn't yet see what those changes would mean for his family. How much longer could he go on like this? The question haunted him, unanswered, as the night stretched on. The envelope arrived in the morning mail, its crisp white paper a stark contrast against the soft gray of the autumn sky outside. Jim Matthews picked it up with trembling hands, his heart already heavy, as if he could sense what was inside before he even opened it. The letter was formal, the kind of thing he had hoped would never find its way into his home. He ripped it open, the words leaping off the page and hitting him harder than anything he could have anticipated. This letter serves as formal notification that Peter Matthews has filed for legal custody of his children, accusing you of kidnapping them. A hearing has been scheduled for next month. The world seemed to stop for a beat, the words on the paper blurring as Jim's vision wavered. He sat back in his chair, the letter crumpling in his fist. What the hell? The words escaped him in a strangled whisper. Kidnapping. He couldn't believe it. This was the son he had loved, the son he had raised. And now Peter was accusing him of this, of stealing his own grandchildren. He felt a strange, sick twist in his stomach, a rush of betrayal that clawed at his insides. Peter's voice echoed in his mind, those final cutting words from their last conversation. The best gift you could give me is if you just died. Jim had thought it couldn't get worse, but now it had. Now, Peter had crossed a line that Jim never thought possible. Karen walked into the room just as Jim sank back into his chair, the letter still clenched tightly in his hand. She looked at the envelope, then at Jim, her expression unreadable at first. Slowly, she sat down beside him, her gaze flicking to the paper, and her breath hitched when she saw the words. "Peter, is this real?" Karen asked quietly, her voice strained. She knew their relationship with Peter had deteriorated, but this? This felt like an unthinkable betrayal, something neither of them had ever expected from him. "I don't know," Jim murmured, his voice thick with emotion. His hands were shaking, the adrenaline of shock surging through him. "He's accusing me of kidnapping them, Karen. Kidnapping." Karen's face softened with a mixture of concern and fear. "Jim, this is huge. Do you think this is his way of punishing you for cutting him off? Or is there something more we don't understand?" Jim clenched his jaw. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He had cut Peter off. He had made the decision to stop supporting him, to stop enabling his behavior. But he never imagined Peter would go this far. He had hoped, foolishly, that Peter would come to his senses, that things would mend themselves with time. But now, it was all spiraling out of control. "I don't know anymore," Jim whispered, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on him. "I can't just let him take them from me, Karen. I've raised those kids for years. They're my grandchildren. I've been their father figure since the day he left." His voice cracked, and for a moment he couldn't continue. The pain of Peter's accusation settled in his chest, tight and suffocating. Karen placed a hand on his arm, her touch a small comfort in the middle of this storm. "I know, Jim, but maybe cutting him off completely. Maybe that went too far. Maybe we should have tried harder to talk to him, to work things out." Jim's anger flared. "You think this is my fault?" he snapped, immediately regretting the harshness in his tone. But Karen didn't flinch. She simply sighed, her eyes filled with both love and frustration. "No," she said softly, "but I'm worried about what this means for all of us. I'm worried about the kids, and I'm worried about you. You've been so focused on doing what's right by them, but what if we've missed something along the way?" Jim leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling. What had gone wrong? Could he have done things differently? Was this his fault after all? The phone rang, breaking the tension. Jim reached for it, hoping for some kind of answer, some kind of guidance. The caller ID read Michael Graham, the attorney he had hired just weeks earlier to help with the financial mess Peter had left behind. Jim's chest tightened. "Hello?" he answered, his voice shaky. "Jim?" Michael's voice came through, calm and professional. "I've seen the papers. I think we need to meet as soon as possible. This is serious, and we need to get ahead of it. Peter's accusations won't just disappear." Jim nodded, the weight of the situation pressing in. "Yeah, I know." His mind was spinning, but Michael's steady presence on the other end was the only thing that felt certain in this moment. "What do I do, Michael? What can I do?" "We'll fight it, Jim," Michael said firmly. "We'll gather everything we need to prove that you've been a constant in those kids' lives. But you need to be prepared. This is going to be messy, and it won't be easy." Jim hung up the phone, a knot tightening in his stomach. The legal battle was just beginning, and worse, the weight of public opinion was starting to shift. Peter's accusations weren't just confined to the courtroom. The community was starting to turn. People were whispering. Some believed Peter. Some were beginning to question Jim's role in the children's lives. He had hoped for peace, for reconciliation, but now it seemed impossible. The weight of everything, his son's betrayal, the fear of losing the children, was too much to bear. And no matter how hard he tried, Jim knew one thing for sure. This fight was far from over. Was it too late to fix things? The question hung in the air as Jim stared out the window, his mind a blur of anger, regret, and the uncertainty of what was coming next. Jim sat at the kitchen table, the early morning light barely filtering through the blinds. The silence of the house felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. His hand trembled slightly as he opened the latest letter, the envelope marked with the bold letters of a creditor. It wasn't the first letter he'd received in recent days, but it was the one that hit hardest. As he read through the harsh demands, The numbers and threats on the paper blurred into an overwhelming fog. Immediate payment required. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Jim set the letter down slowly, a bitter taste in his mouth. Peter's financial mess was now spilling over into Jim's life, and no matter how hard he tried to distance himself, the debts were creeping closer. Peter had always been reckless with money, overspending, dodging bills, living beyond his means. But this was different. These weren't just random bills or overdue credit cards. These were serious legal threats. Jim ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had hoped, prayed even, that Peter's downward spiral would slow, that he would find his way before it destroyed everything around him. But it was clear now that Jim's son had dug himself into a hole too deep to climb out of, and now it was affecting everyone. How had it gotten to this? The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. Jim hesitated before picking it up. He didn't want to hear from anyone else involved in Peter's mess, but the call had to be answered. Jim Matthews. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an edge to it. This is Detective Linda Hartley. I've been investigating some of Peter's financial activities. It seems some of his dealings may be fraudulent. Jim's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to expect, but he sure as hell hadn't anticipated this. Fraudulent. The word felt like a punch to the gut. Peter had always been careless with money, but fraud, it was the kind of accusation that could destroy whatever was left of his reputation, and Jim's too. I'm sorry to bring this to you, Mr. Matthews, Detective Hartley continued, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of concern. But some of Peter's business dealings have raised significant red flags. There are several loans he's taken out under false pretenses, and we're investigating the possibility of financial fraud. Jim leaned back in his chair, his head spinning. Fraud. It seemed unreal, but as the detective went on, detailing some of Peter's questionable actions, misrepresenting his income, forging signatures, taking out loans he couldn't repay, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about Peter's mistakes anymore. This was criminal, and Jim was right in the middle of it. He sat in silence after the call ended, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. Karen appeared in the doorway, her eyes worried as she noticed the unreadable expression on Jim's face. Who was it? She asked quietly, stepping inside the kitchen. Jim didn't respond immediately. His hands were still shaking as he looked down at the pile of letters, the bills, the accusations. Peter, Jim muttered under his breath, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Peter's in deeper than we thought. Karen came over and sat beside him, her hand brushing against his. She had been trying to stay optimistic, hoping that Jim's tough love approach would work, but the situation was rapidly spinning out of control. I told you, Jim, she said softly, her eyes filled with both concern and a hint of frustration. I've been telling you for months now that he needs help. This isn't just about him anymore. It's about the kids. It's about us. How much longer can we just sit by and watch this happen? Jim closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking into him. He had tried to distance himself from Peter, to stop enabling his destructive behavior, but no matter how much he tried to shut that door, it kept creeping open. He thought that by cutting Peter off financially, he was doing the right thing, but the reality was far more complicated. The financial fallout was consuming everything. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe he couldn't just walk away. I know, Karen, Jim said, his voice rough. But if I step in now, what does that teach him? He has to learn. He has to face the consequences of his actions. His eyes flicked to the stack of letters again, his frustration building. If I keep bailing him out, he'll never change. Karen sat back, the tension between them palpable. You can't just let him drown, Jim. I'm afraid that if you do, it won't just be him that's hurt. Jim sat there, his mind in a whirlwind, torn between his instincts and the reality of what he was facing. He had spent years trying to protect Peter from himself, but now the cost of that protection was too high. The bills, the legal threats, the fraud, it was all becoming too much. The phone rang again, cutting through the quiet. Jim looked at the screen, his pulse quickening when he saw it was Peter's number. He let it ring twice before answering, his voice low and guarded. Dad, I need your help." Peter's voice was shaky, almost pleading. "I can't fix this on my own. The legal stuff. The debts. Please, I don't know where else to turn." Jim stared at the phone, his grip tightening. "Help?" The word echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about money anymore. Peter was asking him to clean up the mess, again. And Jim knew, deep down, that if he said yes, he would only be enabling his son's spiral even further. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as Jim tried to find the words. "I can't, Peter," he finally whispered, the words bitter on his tongue. "You've got to fix this yourself." But even as he said it, Jim knew he wasn't sure how much longer he could stand firm. The line between what was right and what was necessary had never felt more blurred. Jim stood in the kitchen, his fingers wrapped tightly around his coffee mug, his gaze fixed on the window. The weight of the conversation with Peter still hung over him like a storm cloud, the bitter taste of his son's desperation lingering in his mouth. For days, he had been firm in his decision to cut Peter off, but the relentless pressure, the calls, the pleading, and now this, the mounting legal mess, had shaken him in ways he wasn't ready to admit. The phone rang again, and Jim didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Peter. He had already ignored half a dozen calls, but the guilt, damn it, the guilt, pulled him toward the phone. He answered, his voice colder than he meant it to be. "Peter." The silence on the other end was heavy before Peter's voice finally cracked through, raw with frustration. "Dad, I need your help. I'm in over my head. This legal stuff, the debts, it's all falling apart. I can't fix this by myself." Jim closed his eyes, the fatigue settling deep into his bones. Part of him wanted to hang up, to cut ties for good and leave Peter to deal with the mess he'd created. But the other part, the part that had never stopped caring, knew he couldn't just turn his back, not entirely. "You should have thought about that before you got yourself into this, Peter." Jim's voice was sharp, but even he could hear the wavering underneath. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal. It was all still there, too fresh. But somewhere beneath it, there was a flicker of something else. A sense of duty. A sense of responsibility. "I know," Peter spat, his voice trembling with frustration. "I know I messed up, but you don't get it, Dad. I've been drowning in this for so long, and every time I try to get out, you pull away. You're just not there when I need you." Jim felt the words hit him like a slap. The accusation, the raw bitterness in his son's voice. It stung deeper than he wanted to admit. He took a steadying breath, trying to hold on to the resolve he had fought so hard to build. "I've been there, Peter. I've done everything I could. I'm not the one who walked away." "You're the one who stayed away." Peter's voice cracked, and Jim heard something he hadn't expected. Desperation. "You raised the kids. You made them think you were their father, but you left me out in the cold. You made me feel like I wasn't good enough. Like I was never enough." The words hit Jim like a wave, knocking the air from his lungs. The old wounds, the ones he had buried under years of anger, resentment, and excuses, suddenly felt raw and exposed. Had he done that? Had he made Peter feel that way? The thought gnawed at him, and for a moment, the rage inside him was replaced by something softer, something painful. Regret. Jim leaned against the counter, his mind drifting back to his own childhood, his own father, who had been distant, unreachable. Jim had always promised he wouldn't repeat those mistakes, but had he? Had he been so focused on protecting himself from Peter's failures that he'd pushed him away when he needed him most? "I wasn't perfect, Peter," Jim said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I tried. I really did." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for the first time in a long while, Jim felt the weight of his son's silence, not as an accusation, but as a sign of something more. Slowly, Peter spoke again, his voice softer now, tinged with something Jim hadn't heard from him in years, genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Dad," Peter said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to push you away. I didn't know how to deal with everything. I've been angry for so long, at you, at myself, at the world. But I've been so lost." Jim closed his eyes, his grip tightening around the phone. He wanted to believe him. He wanted to hear those words and feel the weight of them. But the scars of the past were still too fresh, the betrayals too sharp. Could this apology be real, or was it just another tactic to get what Peter needed? The silence stretched on, and Jim's heart wavered. He had spent so many years building walls between them, convinced that tough love was the answer. But now, as he listened to the vulnerability in Peter's voice, those walls began to crumble. "I'm not saying everything's fixed," Jim said slowly, his voice hoarse. "But I'm not turning my back on you. Not completely. I'll help you with the legal stuff. But this has to change, Peter. You need to take responsibility, and I need to see that you're serious." Peter let out a shaky breath on the other end, and Jim could almost hear the relief. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice barely audible. "I promise I'll do better. I will." Jim hung up the phone, the decision made. He had agreed to help, but it wasn't a clean slate. There were conditions now, conditions he hoped Peter would follow. But even as the words left his mouth, Jim couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this fragile bridge they were starting to rebuild could break just as easily as it had been built. Was this really the right choice? Jim couldn't answer that yet, but as he stood there, staring out the window, he knew one thing for certain. The hardest part was yet to come. The phone call came in the middle of a quiet afternoon, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over Jim's day. It was from the landlord. Peter hadn't been able to make rent again. The last few months had been a constant barrage of bills going unpaid, overdue notices, and mounting debt. Jim felt the tension rise in his chest as he listened to the cold words on the other end of the line. Peter had lost his apartment. It wasn't a shock, not really. Jim had seen the signs, felt them building ever since Peter's downward spiral had started. But hearing the finality in the landlord's voice, made the whole situation feel different, more real. Peter's problems were no longer abstract. They weren't just distant mistakes he could ignore, not just financial mismanagement. They were right there, on Jim's doorstep. Jim hung up the phone and stared out the window, the weight of the call settling over him like a suffocating fog. His first instinct was anger. Anger at Peter for failing to fix his life, for digging this hole so deep, so carelessly. But there was something else there too, something more complicated, an aching, helpless feeling that he couldn't quite name. Karen walked in just as he was sitting down. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone soft, but filled with concern. She could read the lines of frustration and exhaustion on Jim's face, even when he didn't say a word. "Peter lost his apartment," Jim muttered, rubbing his temples. "He can't keep up with anything. The bills, the rent, it's all falling apart." Karen sat down next to him, her hand finding his, a gesture of comfort amidst the tension. "Jim, you can't just keep shutting him out. This isn't helping him. He needs you now more than ever." Jim's chest tightened. "He's had all the chances, Karen. I've given him everything. And look where it's gotten us. Look where it's gotten him. He's spiraling, and I can't keep cleaning up his mess." "But Jim," Karen's voice softened, "you've got to remember. He's your son. He's broken. Don't you see that? This isn't about the money anymore. He's hurting, and you're all he's got left." Jim's jaw clenched. "I've given him more than enough, Karen. More than he deserves." The words stung as they left his mouth. He knew they weren't entirely true, but they were easier to say. Easier than admitting that part of him still wanted to help, still wanted to believe in his son. "Maybe you're right," Karen said quietly, standing up. "But don't close yourself off completely. He's lost so much already. He might lose you too if you walk away now." Jim didn't respond. He couldn't. The guilt, the anger, the sense of betrayal all collided in his chest, leaving him immobilized. But after a long pause, he stood up. He knew what he had to do, even if he didn't want to. He had to see Peter. When Jim arrived at Peter's new place, a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town, he almost didn't recognize the man standing in front of him. Peter looked older, beaten down. His clothes were worn, his eyes hollowed out with exhaustion, and something deeper, regret. "I didn't know where else to go," Peter said, his voice cracking as he stepped aside, letting Jim in. Jim glanced around the apartment. A single room, the furniture sparse, the walls stained and peeling. It felt like the last remnants of a life falling apart. He could almost feel the weight of Peter's failure pressing down on him. "I'm sorry, Dad." Peter's voice trembled as he spoke again, his words coming out in a rush. "I didn't know how bad it was. I didn't mean to push you away. I've been so angry, but that doesn't excuse the way I treated you. You didn't deserve that." Peter's eyes welled with tears, his hands shaking as he wiped his face. The sight of his son, once so proud and defiant, now so broken, hit Jim harder than he expected. He stood there for a moment, the words stuck in his throat. He had spent so much time resisting this moment, avoiding the vulnerability that came with it. "I was wrong," Peter whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." Jim stood still, watching Peter, his anger warring with the surge of empathy rising within him. He wanted to reach out, to say the words that could heal, but the years of disappointment, of betrayal, made it hard to move past the walls that had built up between them. "I've always been here for you, Peter," Jim finally said, his voice low, steady. "But you need to learn to stand on your own. You need to take responsibility for your life. I can't keep fixing things for you, not anymore." Peter nodded, his face crumpling with the weight of his father's words. "I know. I'll get better. I will. I don't know where to start." Jim exhaled, the words a weight he had carried for so long now, finally leaving his mouth. "I'll always be here for you, Peter. But you have to take the first step. You have to fix this yourself." As Jim walked out of the apartment, the door closing softly behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship was at a crossroads. He wasn't sure if Peter could ever fully change, but the small apology, genuine yet fragile, left him with a glimmer of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late, but the road ahead for both of them would be long and uncertain. And as Jim drove away, he couldn't help but wonder if he had just given Peter a chance to rebuild, or if he had merely opened the door to another cycle of failure. The silence between Jim and Peter had become deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence you could ignore. It wasn't peaceful. It was cold, sharp, and filled with unspoken words. Despite their attempts at reconciliation, the chasm between father and son seemed to only widen with each passing day. Jim could feel it every time Peter walked into the room, the air thick with tension. There was no casual conversation anymore, no more of the banter that used to be second nature. Every exchange was curt, guarded, and heavy with the weight of everything they had said and didn't say. Jim felt emotionally drained. It was as though every ounce of energy he had been pouring into trying to fix things was being siphoned away, leaving him hollow. The more he tried to reach out, the further Peter pulled away. The space between them grew, and Jim couldn't figure out how to close it. There was too much anger, too much resentment. He had hoped that by taking a hard stance, by cutting Peter off financially and emotionally, it would force him to stand on his own, to take responsibility for his life. But all it had done was solidify the walls that had already been there, separating them more than ever. Karen, as always, played the mediator. She had tried to be the bridge between them, but the emotional toll was wearing on her too. Every conversation she had with Jim ended the same way: silent frustration, lingering bitterness. Every conversation with Peter was filled with the same defensive posture, the same refusal to take full responsibility for the mess he'd made. Karen was caught in the middle, unsure of how to soothe the wounds on either side. "Jim, you can't keep doing this," she had said to him, her voice cracking the other night, desperate for him to understand. "I know you're angry, but Peter needs you. He's drowning." But Jim couldn't bring himself to soften. Not yet. Not after everything. The anger burned too brightly, the betrayal too raw. He couldn't forget the years Peter had spent avoiding responsibility, blaming others, and walking away from his family. It felt impossible to just let it all go and pretend like things could be fixed with a simple apology. One night, as Jim sat in the living room, flipping through an old photo album, trying to distract himself from the gnawing pain, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Megan. "Jim." Megan's voice was steady, but he could hear the concern beneath it. "I know this isn't easy, but you've got to forgive him." You've got to let it go. He's your son. I don't think he can take much more of this. You can't keep punishing him for what he's done. Please, for everyone's sake." Jim didn't respond right away. Megan was right in some ways. He had to forgive Peter. That's what people did, right? Families forgave each other, worked through the pain. But he couldn't stop the feelings of betrayal that lingered, cutting deeper every time he looked at Peter. How could he forgive someone who had abandoned them so completely? He took a breath, his voice tight. "I'm trying, Megan, I am. But it's hard. So hard." She sighed on the other end, but her voice softened. "I know, Jim, I know. But if you keep holding on to this anger, nothing will ever change. You can't fix the past, but you can change the future." Jim put the phone down and stared out the window. He knew Megan was right. He knew he couldn't keep living like this. But the question still remained. How? How could he let go of the anger, the years of resentment, and start fresh? He didn't know. Meanwhile, Peter seemed to be spiraling further into his own frustrations. Jim could see it in the rare messages Peter sent, each one more bitter than the last. It wasn't just the financial struggles now, it was the deeper emotional toll. Peter was isolating himself, pushing people away, and Jim could feel the weight of it. He could sense the darkness closing in around his son, but no matter how many times he reached out, Peter pushed back harder. One evening, as Jim sat in the quiet of the kitchen, he thought back to all the times he had tried to help Peter. The money, the offers of support, the tough love. It was never enough. But it wasn't just that. It was the emotional distance, the part that no amount of money or material support could ever fix. Cutting Peter off financially hadn't done anything to bridge that gap. It had only made it wider. Jim sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Maybe I was wrong. The realization hit him with a sharp clarity. All these years, he had believed that by removing the safety net, Peter would be forced to stand on his own, to take responsibility. But the truth was, Jim hadn't been forcing Peter to grow. He had been cutting him off in the hopes that Peter would come to his senses. And now, the consequences of that, his son's isolation, his emotional breakdown, had become clear. But it was too late to take it back now, wasn't it? As Jim sat there, caught between the overwhelming weight of guilt and the nagging belief that he had done what was necessary, one thing was clear. The battle for their relationship wasn't over. And Jim wasn't sure where it would lead, or how long it would take to bridge the gap between them. But one thing was certain. This Cold War wasn't ending anytime soon. Jim sat in the dim light of his study, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of an old photo album. His mind was miles away, wandering through memories he wasn't sure he was ready to revisit. Each page of the album, filled with photos of a younger, happier family, felt like a reminder of what had been lost. His eyes lingered on a picture of Peter as a child, his face bright with joy, his eyes full of possibility. How had it come to this? The past few weeks had been filled with tension and unanswered questions. Peter had reached out repeatedly, each apology more heartfelt than the last, each one carrying the weight of his regret. At first, Jim had wanted to believe that these were genuine attempts at reconciliation, that his son was finally taking responsibility for the pain he had caused. But with each apology, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that the damage done to their relationship ran too deep. Words alone couldn't repair the years of neglect, of anger, and most of all, the deep betrayal. Jim's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down, seeing Peter's name flashing on the screen. He hesitated for a long moment before answering, his heart heavy with the familiar mix of frustration and reluctant hope. "Dad," Peter's voice came through, thick with emotion. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I need to say this. I've taken you for granted. All these years, I've been so focused on my own anger and my own problems that I didn't see how much you've been there for me. I've never thanked you for that, and I'm sorry. I've been a selfish idiot." Jim closed his eyes, the weight of Peter's words sinking in. They weren't new, not really. Peter had apologized before, but this time there was something different. There was a rawness in his voice, a vulnerability that Jim couldn't ignore. Part of him wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that his son was truly ready to change. But another part, the part that had been hurt for so long, couldn't help but question the sincerity of it all. Hadn't Peter apologized before? Hadn't he promised to do better? I don't know what you want me to say, Peter. Jim's voice was quiet, tinged with the bitterness that still clung to him. You've said all this before, over and over, but it doesn't change anything. I've been there for you, and you've taken that for granted. You pushed me away when I needed you to show up. And now you expect me to just forgive everything? Peter's voice trembled slightly on the other end. I know I can't change the past, Dad. I need you to know that I understand. I understand what I've done. I was so wrapped up in my own mess that I didn't see what I was doing to you. I'm sorry. Jim's chest tightened. Sorry. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. He had given so much, sacrificed so much, and still, it felt like it hadn't mattered. Why did it have to take him this long to realize what he'd done? Karen's voice cut through the quiet when she stepped into the room, her presence always a calming force, though it felt like the rift between them had grown too wide to bridge. She sat down beside him, her hand finding his. Jim, you've heard him, haven't you? He's reaching out. He's really trying. Jim sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. I don't know, Karen. It's hard. Every time I try to move forward, it feels like I'm just setting myself up for more disappointment. I know, Karen said softly, her fingers brushing his. But forgiveness. It's not just for him. It's for you too. You can't keep holding on to this anger. It's eating you up from the inside. Jim's gaze fell to the floor, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. How could he forgive? Forgiveness wasn't just a word. It was a decision, one that required vulnerability. And Jim had spent so long building walls around his heart, it felt impossible to tear them down now. But Karen was right. The anger, the bitterness, they were suffocating him. Every day they dug in deeper, and he was starting to realize that holding on to them was doing more harm than good. Was he really going to let all this resentment dictate his life? I don't know if I can just forget everything, Jim muttered, his voice thick with emotion. The damage is done, Karen. I don't know how to move past it. Karen squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his. It's not about forgetting, Jim. It's about giving yourself the chance to heal. You don't have to let the past define you. You don't have to hold on to this forever. Jim looked up at her, the weight of the years pressing down on him. He had spent so long trying to protect himself from getting hurt again, but in doing so, he had cut himself off from the one person who mattered most. Was it worth it to keep punishing Peter, to keep punishing himself? Finally, with a heavy sigh, Jim picked up the phone again. His heart pounded in his chest as he called Peter back. The phone rang twice before Peter answered, his voice tentative. Dad? I'm not saying it's going to be easy, Jim began, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. But I'll try. I'll try to be here for you. I won't promise everything will be fixed right away, but I'll try. I want to give you a chance to make things right. Peter's voice broke with relief. Thank you, Dad. Thank you. Jim didn't feel the weight of instant peace. But there was something else, a flicker of hope, fragile but real. Maybe healing wasn't about fixing everything at once. Maybe it was just about taking that first step forward, even when it felt impossible. But as Jim set the phone down, he knew one thing for certain. The road to rebuilding would be long, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. The phone call came late in the afternoon, its shrill tone cutting through the heavy silence of the house. Jim Matthews had been sitting in his favorite chair, his thoughts swirling around the same question he'd been asking himself for weeks. How had things gone so far off track? He hadn't found an answer, not the way he hoped. The pressure of Peter's mess, the debts, the lawsuits, the endless phone calls from creditors, had worn him thin, leaving him feeling more like an observer in his own life than an active participant. But this phone call, the one that was coming now, would force him to face something even darker than he had imagined. Mr. Matthews? The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative. This is Detective Linda Hartley. I need to speak with you about your son, Peter. Jim's stomach clenched. Every time Peter's name came up, his body reacted the same way, tight, defensive, bracing for impact. What about him? he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm afraid Peter's financial troubles have escalated. I've been investigating some of his dealings, and it appears he's involved in a larger scheme. He may face serious legal charges, including fraud and embezzlement. Jim froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. He had suspected Peter's financial problems were bad, but he never imagined it had gone this far. Fraud, embezzlement. Jim gripped the armrest of the chair, his knuckles turning white. Are you saying Peter's been committing fraud? It's possible, Mr. Matthews. I'm not at liberty to share all the details, but we've traced some of his recent activities to a pattern of financial misrepresentation. It's a bigger mess than anyone realized. Jim let the silence hang between them, his mind reeling. How had Peter fallen this far? The questions swirled, but there were no answers, just more confusion, more devastation. I'll be in touch if we need any further information, Detective Hartley continued before hanging up. Jim stood, the weight of the news sinking in like an anchor in his chest. He didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to fix it. His mind was a storm of anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of betrayal. He could already hear Karen's voice in his head. We have to help him. He's your son, Jim. You can't just turn your back on him. Minutes later, Jim found Karen in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The way she was looking at him, the way she held her breath as he walked in, told him everything he needed to know. She'd heard the phone ring, and she knew it wasn't good. Detective Hartley called, Jim said, his voice tight. Peter's involved in something much bigger than I thought. Fraud, embezzlement. This is bad, Karen, really bad. Karen's face paled as the weight of the situation settled over her. She had tried to stay hopeful, to believe that Peter could turn things around. But this was something else. This was a nightmare they hadn't seen coming. We have to help him, Jim, she said quietly, but there was a trembling in her voice. He's your son. He's drowning, and we can't just let him go under. Jim ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling over. Help him? Karen, how many times have I tried to help him? How many times have I stepped in to fix his mess, only for him to make it worse? This is it. This is the end of the line for me. I can't keep doing this. Karen's eyes were filled with worry, but there was a determination in her voice. But Jim, if we don't help him now, he'll lose everything. He could lose the kids. He could lose his future. He's at the bottom, and we're all he has left. Don't you see that? Jim's jaw clenched, his anger mixing with a sense of helplessness. Peter had made this mess. Peter had chosen this path. Yet here he was, once again, trying to figure out how to protect a son who seemed intent on destroying everything Jim had worked for. And it wasn't just Peter's future on the line anymore. Jim's own reputation was at risk. He had always prided himself on providing for his family, on keeping them safe from the storms that had ravaged others. But now, with Peter's actions spiraling out of control, Jim's hard-earned security was being torn apart, piece by piece. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Karen, Jim said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can keep cleaning up his mess. Karen reached for his hand, her grip tight and warm. I know it's hard, Jim. I know it feels like everything's falling apart, but this is still our son. Don't let everything you've built be torn down because of pride. You don't have to fix everything for him, but you have to help him get through this. Jim's eyes hardened as he looked out the window, the weight of it all pressing on him. The phone calls from creditors, the mounting debts, the legal consequences. It was all too much. But Karen was right about one thing. Peter was his son, and if there was even a chance of saving him, Jim had to try. For better or worse, Peter's mess had become their mess. I'll help him, Jim finally said, his voice heavy with resolve. But this time, I'm doing it on my terms. I won't carry him anymore. As he prepared for the inevitable fallout, Jim's anger simmered beneath the surface. But there was something else too. Something deeper. A quiet determination to protect what was left of his family's name, no matter the cost. But as he sat there, staring at the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, this time, there was no easy fix. The weight of the phone call settled on Jim like 1,000 pounds. Peter's voice had been shaking, desperate in a way Jim had never heard before. "Dad, please," Peter had pleaded, his voice cracking. "I don't know where else to turn. The legal bills, the lawsuits. I'm drowning. I'm so close to losing everything. I need your help. Please." Jim had sat there in silence, feeling his heart constrict with a mix of guilt and anger. The man on the other end of the line was the same son who had repeatedly let him down, the same man whose reckless decisions had put them both in this position. And now, after all the years of disappointment, Peter was asking for help, not just a handout, but an intervention that could change the course of his future. But how could Jim help him again? How could he extend a lifeline to someone who had been so willing to drown on his own? He set the phone down and rubbed his face with his hands, the frustration rising like a tide he couldn't control. He thought of all the times he'd been there for Peter, how many chances he'd given, how many times he'd forgiven, only to be burned again. Each time, it felt like Peter was taking more than he could give, like the effort to help was draining him dry. Karen entered the room, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. She had heard the call, seen the look on Jim's face. She knew what he was struggling with, but it didn't make it any easier for either of them. "Jim, he's your son," Karen said softly, walking over to him. "He needs you now more than ever. He's been making mistakes, yes, but he's asking for your help. This could be the last chance he has to turn things around." Jim's gaze was distant, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. How could Karen ask him to do this? How could she expect him to open up again, to trust Peter after everything? His stomach twisted with the bitter taste of betrayal. Why didn't Peter get it? How many times could he let his son take advantage of his good intentions? "I know, Karen," Jim muttered, his voice strained, "but it's too much. He's already taken so much from us, our trust, our time, our energy, and now he's asking for money? For more? I don't know if I can keep doing this." Karen sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. She didn't argue. She didn't have to. She understood the depth of his pain, the frustration of being the one left to pick up the pieces, time and again. But she also knew what Jim couldn't seem to see through his anger, that Peter was broken, that he needed more than just financial help. He needed to feel like he mattered. He needed his father. "Jim, he needs a father right now. He needs you. He's not just asking for money. He's asking for you to believe in him, to show him that no matter how far he's fallen, you'll still be there." Jim's jaw clenched, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, regret, maybe even a small ounce of hope that Karen was right. Could he really close the door completely on his own son? Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Michael Graham, the attorney who had been helping Jim navigate Peter's legal troubles from the start. Jim picked up the call, trying to shake the knot in his stomach. "Jim," Michael's voice was brisk, businesslike. "I've gone over Peter's case, and we're facing some serious legal ramifications here. Fraud, embezzlement. This could land him in prison if we don't move quickly. The financial situation is dire, and without help, we'll have a hard time clearing things up. If you're going to step in, now's the time." Jim's heart sank further. This wasn't just about Peter's future anymore. It was about everything. His reputation, his life's work, everything Jim had built for his family could be tarnished by Peter's mistakes. "I'll need to think about this, Michael," Jim replied, his voice tight. When the call ended, Karen was still waiting by his side, her expression soft but expectant. "What did he say?" "He's right," Jim said, his voice low. "This could wreck Peter's life, and it could destroy everything we've worked for. We can't just stand by and let it happen, but we can't just keep enabling him either." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Jim felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every time he tried to pull away from Peter, he found himself drawn back in, as though the bond between father and son was too strong to sever completely. But Karen was right. Peter needed him now, in a way he never had before, and Jim couldn't just walk away. Could he? "I don't know what to do, Karen," Jim admitted, his voice ragged. "I'm scared. What if I do this, and it's the same thing again? What if he doesn't change?" Karen leaned into him, her voice steady. You're not doing this for Peter, Jim. You're doing it for you. You need to find peace with what's happened. If you're going to help him, you need to do it on your terms. You can't keep sacrificing yourself. Jim nodded, his mind heavy with the decision. He had always done what was necessary, what was right, but this was different. This was his son, and he couldn't just walk away. After a long pause, Jim stood up, his decision made. "I'll help him," he said, the words harder than he wanted them to be. "But this time, it's on my terms. He has to take responsibility for his actions moving forward. No more excuses." Karen's eyes softened with relief, though Jim could see the worry still there. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jim felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe this time, things would be different. But as he sat down to prepare for the financial fallout ahead, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into another storm. Would Peter truly change, or was this just another attempt at redemption doomed to fail? Only time would tell. The weeks that followed Jim's decision to help Peter felt like a slow and painful march towards something neither of them fully understood. Jim had agreed to assist with the legal issues, to clear the immediate financial mess, but the weight of his decision pressed on him every day. He couldn't help but feel like he was stepping into the unknown, tethered by the hope that Peter was finally ready to change, even as his instincts screamed that this was another false start. Peter had started therapy, finally willing to confront the deeper issues that had driven him to his reckless behavior. Jim watched from the sidelines, cautious but curious. For the first time in years, Peter was taking a hard look at himself. He spoke about childhood memories, about the anger he'd carried, the resentment he'd buried. But even as Peter opened up, Jim struggled to trust him. The wounds Peter had inflicted over the years were deep, and no amount of therapy, no matter how well-intentioned, could heal them overnight. Jim sat in his office one evening, his gaze fixed on the stacks of paperwork in front of him, but his mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on Peter, sitting across from a therapist for the third time that week. It was hard to reconcile the image of the son who had once been so full of potential with the broken man who now sat in a sterile office talking about his mistakes. Jim couldn't help but wonder if this was just another phase, another promise that would eventually fade when things got difficult. He still didn't trust Peter completely. Could he? How could he, after everything? Jim had given so much over the years, only to have it thrown back in his face. His mind kept flashing back to the anger in Peter's voice, the accusations, the bitterness that had built up between them. The phone call from Karen interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "Jim," her voice was soft, but filled with concern. "I know it's hard, but Peter's making progress. He's sticking with therapy, and that's something. He's trying, Jim. He's really trying." Jim's chest tightened at the sound of her voice. He knew she was right, but the fear of being let down again kept him on edge. "I don't know, Karen. I can't shake the feeling that we're walking a tightrope. I don't know how long I can keep doing this." Karen was quiet for a moment before responding. "I see it, Jim. I see the change in him, but I also see the strain it's putting on you. It's like we're both walking on eggshells around Peter. I'm worried about us. I'm worried about you." Jim sat back in his chair, his mind swirling. The tension between helping Peter and protecting his own emotional well-being was eating him alive. He wanted to be there for his son. He had to be there. But at what cost? Could he keep sacrificing his own peace just to help Peter find his way? It was a question he couldn't answer. Later that evening, Megan called. Jim's old friend had been a constant support through all the chaos, and her voice on the other end always carried a sense of calm he needed. "You're doing the right thing, Jim." Megan's voice was warm but firm. "I know it's hard, but you're seeing the signs. He's taking responsibility for his actions, for the first time in years. That's progress, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Jim leaned back, running his hand through his hair. "It's just so hard, Megan. Every time I think I'm getting through to him, something else happens. I'm just tired of being disappointed." "I get it," Megan replied softly. "But you have to focus on the positives, the therapy, the fact that he's showing up. That's all real. You can't keep holding his past against him, or you'll never move forward. The words hit Jim harder than he expected. Move forward. Could he? He had spent so many years trying to protect himself from Peter's mistakes, from the emotional toll of always being the one to pick up the pieces. But now, as he thought about the future, he realized he couldn't keep living in the past. He couldn't keep waiting for the next disaster to strike. As the days passed, Jim did start to see glimpses of the son he once knew, the son who had been so full of promise, who had the world at his feet. Peter started taking responsibility for the smallest things, making decisions without relying on Jim, taking ownership of his finances, and for the first time in years, showing genuine remorse. The walls Jim had built between them began to crack, just a little. But still, the fear lingered. Was this really the change he had been hoping for, or was it just another temporary fix? Jim couldn't ignore the haunting question that shadowed every step forward. What if this is just another cycle? One evening, after another tense dinner, where Peter seemed unusually quiet, Jim sat in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. What now? He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Peter's journey was one worth taking. But the fear of falling back into the same old patterns, the same painful cycles, still gripped Jim's heart. As the night stretched on, Jim stared at the clock, knowing that no matter how much he wanted to believe in Peter, the future was still uncertain. Could this really be the beginning of something new, or would it all fall apart again? The quiet hum of the evening settled into Jim's bones as he sat at the kitchen table, the paper spread out before him like an unwanted reminder of all that was still unresolved. His eyes traced the familiar documents, but his mind was far from the numbers in front of him. It had been weeks since he agreed to help Peter, weeks since they'd started this fragile attempt at rebuilding. And yet, as the days stretched on, Jim couldn't shake the growing fear gnawing at him. Peter's progress had been slow but steady at first. The therapy sessions, the small steps toward taking responsibility. Jim had allowed himself to feel a sliver of hope. But now, the cracks were starting to show. The optimism had begun to fade, replaced by a familiar sense of dread. Peter had stopped attending therapy as regularly. His job search was sluggish, his efforts half-hearted. Every time Jim asked about his progress, Peter's answers felt evasive, and his excuses started to sound hollow. Jim leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Was this the start of the same cycle again? It didn't take much for Jim's trust in Peter to falter. He had been burned too many times before. Every new promise Peter made was weighed against the past. What if this is just another act? What if he's going to let me down again? Jim's fingers drummed nervously on the table, the uncertainty settling deeper into his gut. Jim, what's going on with you? Karen's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her face creased with concern. You've been distant all week. You're not even talking to Peter about what's happening. This isn't helping him. Jim didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the papers, the numbers nothing more than a blur. I don't know what to say, Karen, he finally muttered. I've done everything I can, but I'm not sure it's making any difference. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Karen's expression tightened. She crossed the room and sat beside him, her voice gentle but insistent. You have to believe that he can change, Jim. You've given him a second chance, and you need to give him time. You're holding on to this anger, this distrust. I know you're scared, but family is about second chances. You can't keep punishing him for his past mistakes. Jim's chest tightened at her words. Punishing him? He wasn't trying to punish Peter. He just wanted to protect himself from the hurt that always seemed to follow. But Karen's plea made him feel the weight of his own walls, built so high that it felt impossible to let them down. I don't know if I can do that, Karen, Jim whispered, his voice cracking under the pressure. I don't know if I can keep hoping for change and getting nothing in return. Karen's expression softened, her hand finding his. I get it, Jim, I do. But you have to decide. Do you want to keep holding on to this, or do you want to try again? Because if you keep holding back, you might lose him for good. Just then, Jim's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with Megan's name. He sighed as he picked it up, grateful for the familiar, calm presence of his old friend. "Hey, Megan," he said, trying to sound normal, but she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I've been listening to you," Megan said, her tone firm but understanding. "You're stuck, Jim. You've got this battle raging inside of you, and it's eating you up. You want to help Peter, but you're holding on to the past. You need to let go of that anger if you want to move forward, for his sake and for your own. You can't keep punishing him for things that are already done." Jim rubbed his face, the guilt surging in waves. Could she be right? He had been so focused on the hurt Peter had caused him that he hadn't allowed himself to move past it. Every conversation, every attempt at rebuilding felt weighed down by the bitterness that had taken root in his heart. Could he truly forgive Peter? Could he let go? Before he could respond, his phone rang again. This time, it was Detective Linda Hartley. The seriousness in her voice when she spoke only added to the tension in Jim's chest. "Mr. Matthews, we've been following up on Peter's case. I wanted to update you. Some of his previous actions have caught the attention of law enforcement, and it's possible that he may face legal consequences for his involvement in the financial scheme we discussed earlier." Jim's stomach twisted. The weight of the news pressed down on him, the familiar sense of helplessness threatening to take over. He had tried to help Peter, but the truth was, no matter how hard he tried to fix things, they were still spiraling. "Is there anything I can do to prevent this?" Jim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid not," Detective Hartley replied. "This is out of your hands. We'll need to proceed with the investigation. But Peter is going to face the consequences of his actions, whether he likes it or not." The phone call ended, leaving Jim to sit in stunned silence. Karen's voice broke through the haze again. "Jim, what's going on?" Jim shook his head, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. "Peter's in deeper than I thought, and now there's nothing I can do to protect him. The law's involved." Karen placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out. But you have to decide, Jim. Do you turn away, or do you try to help him face the consequences?" The question lingered in the air, the decision hanging between them like a heavy curtain. Jim felt the weight of it all, torn between his need for peace and the undeniable pull of fatherly love. Could he help Peter, even when the road ahead was filled with legal battles and uncertainty? Would the anger that still simmered beneath the surface prevent him from doing the right thing? The silence stretched, and Jim's heart ached with the weight of choices yet to be made. The night air was thick with tension as Jim sat in the living room, the light from the television flickering in the corner, illuminating the silence that had settled between him and Peter. Jim couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut, the one that had been growing steadily for weeks. He'd always believed that Peter was on the verge of turning a corner, that this time would be different. But the truth was starting to sink in. Peter was still lying. It had started with small things. His promises to attend therapy regularly had been half-hearted at best, his job search more of a passive hope than an actual effort. But tonight, Jim had stumbled across something that cut deeper than any of it. The email from Peter's therapist, confirming that Peter had been skipping sessions for weeks. And just last night, Peter had told Jim he was making progress, that he was committed to change. It was a lie. Jim's chest tightened as the weight of it hit him. How could he keep believing in him? How could he keep investing his time, his energy, and his trust into a son who wouldn't even be honest about the smallest things? The anger inside him flared, but it was quickly suffocated by a deep, heavy sadness. This was it, the final straw. His heart felt hollow as he sat there, staring at the screen but not seeing anything. The anger was fading now, replaced by something far more insidious, disillusionment. He had given Peter every chance he could, but in the end, it didn't matter. Jim had invested years into trying to fix Peter's life, trying to make up for the mistakes he'd made, but nothing had changed. Maybe it was never going to. Karen entered the room quietly, her eyes scanning Jim's face. "You okay?" she asked softly, though she could tell by his expression that he wasn't. "Peter's been lying about his progress," Jim muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "He hasn't been going to therapy, and his job search, he's barely even trying. All of this, it's just a game to him. Karen's face fell as she processed his words. She'd seen the signs, of course, but hearing it confirmed made the weight of it real. She sat down beside him, reaching for his hand, but Jim pulled away. The silence between them grew thick. "I know you're angry," Karen said, her voice tender but firm. "But Jim, we can't keep doing this. You can't keep punishing Peter for everything he's done. Yes, he's messed up, but he's your son. You can't just turn your back on him." Jim's gaze hardened, and he stood up, pacing the room. "I don't know what else I'm supposed to do, Karen. I've done everything I can. Every time I try to help him, he keeps lying, keeps making the same mistakes." "I'm done." Karen's voice shook slightly. "No, Jim, you're not done. You can't be. He's still your son, and he needs you. We can't just let this go. I won't let you." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Karen knew Jim was hurting, but she was hurting too, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her compassion for Peter. She felt trapped, unable to bridge the growing gap between father and son. The frustration that had been simmering in her for so long bubbled to the surface. "I can't keep doing this either, Jim. You're so focused on his mistakes that you can't see the good he's trying to do. You're just pushing him away. You're pushing us away." Jim flinched as if the words had physically struck him. He knew it was true. He had been withdrawing emotionally, building walls around himself that only made the situation worse. But it wasn't that simple. How could he forgive Peter when it felt like the wounds were still so fresh, so deep? Every time he let Peter back in, it felt like he was just setting himself up for more disappointment. Megan's voice on the phone that night offered a small, steady voice of reason. "Jim," she said, her tone kind but insistent, "I know you're angry, but you have to remember, family can heal. Peter's still trying. He's trying to fix himself, and you can't keep holding on to the past. You can't keep punishing him for everything he's done." "I don't know, Megan," Jim said, his voice low. "I want to believe that, I really do. But every time I think we're getting somewhere, he falls back into the same old habits." "How many times can I give him the benefit of the doubt?" Megan sighed on the other end, and Jim could almost hear the sadness in her voice. "You're not just doing this for him, Jim. You're doing this for yourself, too. You've got to find a way to let go of that anger, or it will tear you apart." The conversation ended, but the words stuck with Jim, echoing in his mind. He had been so focused on protecting himself, on not being hurt again, that he hadn't stopped to think about what his own anger was costing him. He was losing Peter, losing a part of himself, all because he couldn't forgive. The next morning, Jim confronted Peter. The confrontation wasn't loud, but the words were sharp. Peter was defensive, his guilt manifesting as anger, but Jim stood firm. "I'm done with the lies, Peter. If you want to be part of this family, you have to be honest with me. No more games." The conversation left both of them shaken. The divide between them was wider than ever. Peter left the room without another word, and Jim sat down heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. Had he been too harsh? Could they ever fix this? The family was fractured now, each of them standing on opposite sides of a growing divide, unsure of how to move forward. Jim didn't know if he had the strength to bridge the gap between him and his son. And even if he did, was Peter willing to meet him halfway? As Jim stared at the door where Peter had walked out, he knew one thing for certain. Nothing was ever going to be the same again. Jim sat in the dim light of the kitchen, his hands folded tightly on the table in front of him. His thoughts swirled around in a dizzying spiral, frustration, anger, exhaustion. The phone call with Peter had been the last straw, another request, another desperate plea for money, for help with the mounting legal bills. It was becoming too much. It wasn't just the money anymore. It was the manipulation, the endless cycle of dishonesty that left Jim feeling hollow, betrayed beyond repair. Peter had promised that he was turning things around. He had been working hard at his therapy, he said. "I'm committed now, Dad," he'd pleaded, his voice that familiar mix of desperation and entitlement. But Jim knew better. Peter had promised this over and over, each time with no follow-through. The lies were wearing him down. Jim had tried. He had bent over backwards to support his son, to help him heal, but every time, Peter had found a way to squander it. The call ended like all the others. With Peter's apologies, with his promises to change. But Jim didn't feel the usual flicker of hope anymore. No, this time all he felt was cold. Enough was enough. A loud knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. He knew who it was before the sound even reached his ears. Peter. Of course. Jim had known this moment was coming, and now it was here. He stood up, his heart heavy, his resolve hardening. When Peter stepped through the door, he was exactly how Jim expected him, disheveled, with that familiar look of someone caught in the middle of a storm he couldn't control. "Dad," Peter began, his voice quieter than usual, "I need your help. I can't do this on my own. The bills, the lawyer, it's all spiraling, and I don't know where else to turn." Jim's jaw clenched, and he held up a hand to stop Peter before he could finish. "No," he said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. "I'm done." Peter looked at him, stunned. What? What do you mean, done?" "I mean, I'm done," Jim repeated, his voice steady now, but it was hard to ignore the anger beneath the surface. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep giving you everything and watching you throw it all away. How many times do I have to pick up the pieces for you, Peter? I've given you everything, and you've thrown it all away. You think I'm just a safety net you can fall back on whenever things get tough?" Peter took a step back, shock and disbelief clouding his face. "Dad, No!" Jim cut him off, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get to come in here and play the victim anymore. I've done everything I can. I have done everything for you, and you keep lying to me, asking for more. How am I supposed to believe anything you say when you've done this time and time again?" Peter's expression crumpled as Jim's words hit him like a slap. For the first time in a long while, Jim saw something more vulnerable than the defensive anger Peter usually wore, a crack in the armor. Peter opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He seemed to shrink, as though the weight of Jim's accusation had crushed him under its force. I never meant to," Peter began, but his voice broke. Tears welled in his eyes, his chest rising and falling with shaky breaths. "I've never been good enough, Dad. I know I've failed you. I've never been able to live up to your expectations. But I swear, I am trying. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to be the son you want me to be." Jim's anger softened for a fraction of a second, but the hurt that had been building for so long surged back, overwhelming him. His mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions, but there was one thing he knew with absolute certainty. He couldn't keep enabling this anymore. He stepped forward, his voice cold, but his chest tightening with the weight of it all. "You've broken my trust, Peter," Jim said quietly, almost to himself. "You've lied to me, used me, and now you expect me to just keep forgiving you. You think that's what a father's supposed to do?" Peter's face twisted in grief, the tears falling freely now as he crumbled under the weight of his father's words. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I don't know how to fix this. I've messed everything up." Jim turned away, his heart breaking but hardening at the same time. Could he really forgive him? Could he really give Peter another chance after everything that had happened? The anger, the disappointment, it felt too big, too deep. His voice was low, but unwavering as he finally spoke again. "You need to learn to stand on your own, Peter. You can't keep coming to me every time you make a mistake. I've given you everything, and I can't do it anymore." Karen entered the room at that moment, her face drawn with worry. "Jim, please," she said, her voice trembling as she moved toward him. "He's your son. Don't you see? He's falling apart. We need to find a way to come together, not pull further apart." Jim looked at her, the strain between them evident. He could hear the sadness in her voice, the desperation. She wanted him to forgive, to heal. But how could he? How could he forget the damage Peter had caused? The words felt stuck in Jim's throat as he stood there, torn between the father he wanted to be and the man he had become. In the silence that followed, he could hear the churning inside of him, his thoughts racing with self-doubt. Had he been too harsh? Was he wrong to finally draw the line? Peter stood there, still broken, his eyes pleading, and Jim couldn't bring himself to say anything more. The silence between them felt suffocating, and the divide between father and son seemed wider than ever before. As Jim turned away, the weight of his decision settled over him. Could he really leave it all behind, or was there still a chance for redemption? Jim didn't know, and as the door closed behind Peter, Jim's heart wavered, torn between protecting himself and trying to save his son. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with tension, as Jim Matthews sat in the back, his hands clenched tightly together. The harsh fluorescent lights above made everything feel sterile, too bright, too revealing. He had never imagined he'd be here, not like this, not as a spectator to his own son's downfall. Peter sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his shoulders hunched in a way that Jim had never seen before. He looked small, smaller than Jim had ever expected his son to look, even in this moment of reckoning. Peter wasn't the defiant young man he once was. Now, he was just a broken shell of the person Jim had tried so desperately to help, and it hurt in ways Jim couldn't even begin to explain. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge's gavel came down, signaling the start of the proceedings. Jim's heart thudded in his chest, each beat heavy with guilt, with disappointment. He couldn't bring himself to look at Peter, couldn't bring himself to make eye contact. He had tried so hard for so many years to pull Peter out of the mess he'd created. But every time Jim thought they were getting somewhere, Peter would take one more step backward. As the prosecutor stood up and began listing the charges, fraud, financial mismanagement, embezzlement, Jim's mind drifted back to all the times Peter had promised that he was going to do better. The empty promises, the lies that had piled up over the years. He had always told himself that Peter could change, that with enough support, with enough love, his son could turn his life around. But this was something Jim couldn't fix. Peter had crossed a line that no amount of forgiveness or money could erase. Jim, Karen's voice came from beside him, a soft whisper that barely cut through the noise of the courtroom. She was sitting next to him, her hand gently resting on his arm, but he could feel the strain in her touch. She was trying to hold it together, trying to keep the family from falling apart. Her voice, though quiet, was filled with urgency. You need to be there for him. This isn't just about the legal stuff. It's about showing him that you're not abandoning him. He's still your son. Jim squeezed his eyes shut for a brief moment, as if the darkness behind his eyelids could shield him from the weight of her words. Abandoning him? Could he really do that? Could he really stand in the back of the room, watching his son face the consequences of his actions without stepping forward? His heart wavered, torn between the anger that had built up over the years and the undeniable pull of fatherly love. But Jim didn't know if he could bring himself to stand by Peter's side, not after everything, not after all the years of lies, the years of Peter taking from him without ever giving anything in return. It felt like a betrayal to be there for him now, like giving in, like allowing Peter to escape the consequences of his actions with just another chance. The judge called for a recess, and Jim's gaze finally lifted to meet Peter's. Peter was staring ahead, avoiding his father's eyes, his jaw tight. The shame radiated from him like a heavy fog, and Jim couldn't help but feel the weight of it too. He was ashamed too, ashamed that his son had ended up here, ashamed that all of Jim's efforts had led to this courtroom, this moment of public humiliation. Karen's voice broke through the quiet tension again, a whisper that no one else could hear. Jim, please, we can't go on like this. You can't keep turning away from him. If you want to repair this, you have to be there now. The words hit him like a punch. He could feel the anger, the grief, and the exhaustion weighing on him, but Karen was right. If he wanted any chance of repairing what was left of their family, he had to act now. This wasn't just about Peter's mistakes, it was about Jim's own. He had distanced himself so much, kept his walls so high, that maybe he had made things worse. Maybe he had abandoned Peter in a way too. Peter turned slightly, his eyes meeting Jim's for a fleeting second. The look on his son's face was enough to break Jim's heart. Guilt, shame, desperation, all wrapped up in those eyes. And then, almost as if he had to force it, Peter spoke, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with something Jim had never heard before. Regret. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you. I've screwed everything up, and I know you won't ever forgive me for it. But please, I need you now. I need you to help me through this." Jim stood frozen for a moment, his chest tight, his emotions a whirlwind inside him. He could feel Karen's hand on his arm, urging him to respond, to act. But Jim wasn't sure how to respond. Could he forgive Peter? Could he help him now, knowing that this was the result of Peter's own choices? The session resumed, and as Jim watched the prosecutor lay out the severity of Peter's crimes, the gravity of it all began to hit him. This was real. There were consequences. Peter's future was hanging in the balance, and Jim had no idea what to do. Should he show up for Peter, stand by him, or was this the moment to let him face the full weight of his actions? When the verdict was finally read, it wasn't the life-shattering sentence Jim had feared. Peter was given a mild sentence, community service, probation. But the emotional toll was still immense. Peter's shame and regret were written all over his face as he sat down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jim's heart ached as he saw the devastation in his son's eyes. He had chosen not to abandon him. He had chosen to stand by him, but for how long? As the gavel came down and the courtroom began to empty, Jim could feel the weight of the decision still hanging over him. They had a long road ahead, and Jim didn't know if the cracks in their relationship could ever fully heal. But as they walked out of the courtroom together, Jim realized something. This was just the beginning. The road to reconciliation was going to be long, and the healing would take time. But maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. The house felt quieter now. The tension that had once permeated every room, every conversation, had softened, though it hadn't disappeared. Jim Matthews sat in the living room, the low hum of the air conditioning, the only sound, breaking the stillness. Peter was upstairs, probably lost in his own thoughts, his own battles. Jim's mind, however, was consumed with questions that never seemed to stop. Had he done enough? Was it too late? Every step forward in the fragile rebuilding of their relationship felt as though it could collapse at any moment. After the court proceedings and the harsh confrontation with Peter, things had been quieter, not better, just quieter. The cracks in their relationship were still there, deep and jagged, but for the first time in a long while, Jim was starting to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving through it, step by painful step. Therapy had been part of Jim's effort to move forward, though it was never easy. Sitting across from a therapist, talking about his pain, his regrets, it was something Jim had avoided for years. But it became clear that he couldn't fix things with Peter until he fixed himself. Each session unearthed layers of emotion that Jim had buried deep inside him. The anger he had carried for so long, the sense of betrayal, and the most painful realization of all, his own fear of vulnerability. It was easier to stay angry, easier to hide behind the walls he had built around his heart, but it wasn't helping anyone. Not Peter, not Karen, not even himself. In therapy, Jim began to see that his inability to connect fully with Peter was a reflection of his inability to connect with his own emotions. Vulnerability had always felt like weakness to him, and the deeper the pain, the harder it was to let it show. But now, the walls were slowly beginning to crack, and with each crack, a little more light began to shine through. Peter, on the other hand, was still struggling. His therapy sessions were inconsistent at best, his progress slow, and every time Jim tried to reach out, there was a sense of resistance, of hesitation, that still lingered. Peter was doing the work, trying to undo years of bad habits, but it wasn't easy. It never was. Jim could see the effort, the small steps Peter was taking, but it was hard to shake the feeling that Peter had become a stranger, someone Jim no longer fully recognized. "I just don't know, Karen," Jim admitted one evening, his voice tired, worn. They were sitting on the couch together, the quiet hum of the house surrounding them. "I see the effort, but I don't know if I can trust him again. Every time I let myself believe things are changing, something else falls apart." "How do I know he's really trying this time?" Karen placed a gentle hand on his. "I know you're scared, Jim. I see it. But Peter's not going to change overnight. He's made so many mistakes, And it's not just on him to fix it. You have to meet him halfway, even when it's hard. This isn't about perfection. It's about trying, over and over again. Jim looked at her, her words sinking in like a weight that he couldn't shake. She was right, of course. Trying was the key. He had spent so many years waiting for Peter to make that dramatic, perfect change, but that wasn't how it worked. Healing took time. And trust? That was something that could only be rebuilt slowly, a little at a time. The next few weeks passed in a quiet blur. There were small moments, brief conversations, where Jim saw glimpses of the son he had once known. Peter would offer a tentative apology, or Jim would see him quietly working on his job applications. They were baby steps, but they were steps nonetheless. And slowly, Jim began to appreciate those moments more. A shared dinner, a brief conversation on the couch. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Jim's walls had come down just enough to see the humanity in Peter again, but there was still so much left unsaid. The pain, the betrayal. They weren't gone. They never would be. But Jim had started to see, maybe for the first time, that Peter's mistakes didn't define him. They were part of him, but they weren't all of him. And maybe, just maybe, that was the key to healing. One evening after dinner, Jim and Peter sat down together in the living room. The weight of the moment hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Jim finally broke the silence, his voice rough. "I know I've been hard on you, Peter. I've been angry, but I've also been scared. Scared of being hurt again. Scared of letting you in, when every time I do, you disappoint me." Peter looked up, his face serious, vulnerable. "I know, Dad. I've done a lot of things that made you not trust me. I don't expect things to go back to normal overnight. I just want to show you that I can do better. I can be better." Jim's heart tightened, and for a moment, all the old pain rushed to the surface. But then he saw it in Peter's eyes. Something real, something raw. Peter was trying, and that was all Jim could ask for. "I don't know what the future holds," Jim said, his voice quiet but steady. "But I want to try. I'm not promising everything's going to be fixed, but I'm willing to try. For both of us." Peter nodded, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down again." And in that moment, Jim realized that healing wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't a magic fix. It was a journey, one that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to confront the past. As Jim sat there, looking at his son, a fragile sense of hope stirred within him. The road ahead was still long, and the scars would never fully disappear. But maybe, just maybe, they were finally heading in the right direction. The quiet of the room felt different now. Not perfect, but something like peace. And for the first time in a long time, Jim allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. It was an early morning, the kind where the light is soft and the world still feels a little sleepy. Jim sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, his mind wandering back to the same question he had asked himself 1,000 times over the past few months. Can we fix this? He had watched Peter struggle, watched him fall into old habits, fall behind on his promises. But today felt different. Jim didn't know why exactly, but there was a shift in the air, a quiet shift that made him feel, for the first time in a long while, that maybe things could change. The sound of the doorbell startled him out of his thoughts. He set down his coffee cup, his gaze flicking to the front door. He didn't need to look at the clock to know who it was. He had been expecting Peter, though he didn't know what the conversation would be this time. With Peter, it was always a gamble. Sometimes there was hope. Other times, nothing but more disappointment. When Jim opened the door, Peter was standing there, not looking for money, not pleading for help, but holding something in his hands, an idea. Peter's eyes were tired, but there was a spark in them that Jim hadn't seen in a long time. He could feel it before Peter even spoke. "Dad, I need your help with something," Peter said, his voice steady, almost hesitant. "I want to start a small business. I've been thinking about it for a while now, and I think it's time. But this time I'm not asking for money. I just need your advice." The words hit Jim harder than he expected. No plea for financial help, no excuses. Just a son, standing in front of him, willing to take responsibility for his own future. Jim stared at him for a long moment, trying to absorb what had just been said. He wasn't sure how to feel. It was as though a weight had been lifted from his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. "I'm listening," Jim said, his voice quiet, carefully controlled. His mind raced, trying to grasp what had just happened. Could Peter really be ready to change? Peter explained his idea, his voice filled with a tentative excitement that Jim hadn't heard in years. He spoke about what he wanted to build, the kind of work he wanted to do, the long hours he was willing to put in. Jim listened, his instincts telling him to stay cautious. But there was something about the way Peter spoke, something that felt different from all the past promises and disappointments. There was a sincerity to it. When Peter finished, Jim took a deep breath. His mind was still processing, but he knew this moment was important. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about fixing the past. This was about moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, Jim saw Peter for who he could become. Not the son who had disappointed him time and time again, but the man he was trying to be. "I'm not going to hand you money, Peter," Jim said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "But I'll help you with advice. I can't do this for you. You need to do the work. But if you're serious about this, I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Peter's eyes flickered with something, relief, maybe, or gratitude, but it was fleeting. He nodded, the weight of Jim's words settling on him. "I won't let you down, Dad. I'll make it work." Jim nodded back, the conversation hanging between them like a bridge, tentative but real. As Peter walked away, Jim stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he had meant to. Something had shifted. Something felt different. He wasn't sure if it was too soon to hope, but he allowed himself to feel it anyway. A flicker of hope. Later that day, Karen noticed the change in Jim. He was more present, less distant. She watched as he sat down with Peter, talking about business plans, strategy, and goals. There was a quiet camaraderie between them, something she hadn't seen in years. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. She reached for Jim's hand, squeezing it gently. "I think we're getting there, Jim," she said, her voice filled with cautious optimism. "This is good." Jim looked at her, his expression softening. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Peter, who was deep in thought, sketching out plans for his business. "I think he's ready this time," Jim finally said, though his voice was still tinged with uncertainty. "But it's going to take time." Karen smiled, her eyes filled with relief. "We've got time." Later, Jim received a call from Megan. Her voice was steady, as always, but there was an underlying warmth to it. "Jim," she said softly, "family healing takes time. This is just the beginning. There's a long way to go, but you're doing the right thing. You've given him a chance to prove himself, and that's what matters. One step at a time." Jim sat back, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. There was a long way to go. The road ahead would be slow, and there would be setbacks. But for the first time, he was willing to take that journey with Peter. The emotional walls Jim had built for so long started to crumble. He could feel it, the vulnerability, the fear of getting hurt again, all of it slowly loosening its grip on him. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was no longer controlling him. And for the first time in a long while, Jim began to believe in the possibility of something better, something that could heal them both. As he looked at Peter, working at the table, he felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet, fragile hope that, for once, things could finally be different. The road ahead wasn't clear, but they were walking it together, and that made all the difference. The kitchen was filled with the warmth of the holiday dinner, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling the air. It wasn't a grand affair, just a quiet, intimate gathering, but it felt different this year. Jim stood at the counter, chopping vegetables, the rhythm of the knife steady in his hands. As he worked, he glanced over at Peter, who was setting the table. For the first time in a long while, Jim didn't feel the weight of resentment hanging between them. It was hard to admit, but the walls had started to come down, little by little. Peter's presence was a reminder of how far they'd come. There had been times when Jim wasn't sure they'd ever make it to this point. His son, once so distant and lost, now seemed different, more grounded, more aware of the consequences of his actions. Peter wasn't the same young man who had repeatedly broken Jim's trust. He had changed, at least in the ways that mattered most. And Jim, for the first time in years, felt the possibility of redemption, not just for Peter, but for himself, too. "Dad." Peter's voice broke through the quiet. Jim turned to see his son standing in the doorway, a hesitant smile on his face. "I just wanted to say thank you for believing in me again, for giving me this chance." Jim's heart clenched. Peter had come a long way, but the sincerity in his voice caught Jim off guard. Peter's eyes were earnest, his expression unguarded, and for a fleeting moment, Jim could see the young man he had always hoped Peter could be. "You've earned it," Jim said quietly, setting the knife down and wiping his hands on a dish towel. "You've done the work. I'm proud of you." Peter looked down at the floor for a moment, a quiet emotion passing through him. "I don't think I could have done it without you, without the chance to prove myself." His voice was softer now, vulnerable in a way Jim hadn't heard in years. "I don't know if I ever really understood what it meant to be a man. I thought I did, but I was wrong. I thought everything was just supposed to come to me. But I get it now. I have to make it happen on my own." Jim nodded, his eyes briefly closing as he absorbed his son's words. He had waited for so long to hear them, and now that they were spoken, they felt like a weight lifting from his chest. This was the moment, Jim realized, the one where everything they had been through, all the pain and the distance, had led them here. Later that evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. It wasn't extravagant. There were no grand gestures or elaborate speeches. But the quiet comfort of their togetherness, the way Karen smiled at Peter, the way Jim looked at his son, not with judgment, but with quiet pride, spoke volumes. They had made it through something dark, something painful, and here they were, together. As they ate, Jim's mind drifted back to the journey that had brought them here. The years of struggle, the disappointment, the countless times he had questioned whether it was worth it. His own anger had once been a wall he couldn't tear down. He had told himself that protecting his own heart meant shutting Peter out, but now he saw how wrong he had been. He had tried to control everything, to fix everything, but in the end, all he could do was allow for the possibility of change. Karen caught his gaze across the table, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had both borne the weight of Peter's mistakes, but they had also carried each other through the storm. Their marriage had been tested, strained, but it had endured. And in this small, quiet moment, sitting at the dinner table, surrounded by the remnants of a simple meal, Jim felt the strength of that bond more than ever. After dinner, as the dishes were cleared away and the family settled into the living room, Jim found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He had spent so much of his life holding on to the past, clinging to the wounds that had shaped him. But now, as he watched Peter, now more mature and ready to take responsibility for his life, Jim knew that it was time to let go. He wasn't letting go of his love for his son. That would never change. But the anger, the resentment, it no longer had a place in his heart. The boundaries he had once built to protect himself from pain were starting to fade, and in their place, a new understanding of love was taking root. True love came with boundaries, he thought. It came with trust. Peter was ready. Jim was finally ready to trust him again. As the evening wore on, Peter shared his plans for the future, a new job, a fresh start. Jim listened, not with the skepticism he once would have, but with a quiet pride. Peter wasn't asking for his help this time. He wasn't looking for a handout. He was standing on his own, and for the first time, Jim believed that he could succeed. The family, once fractured by old wounds, was beginning to heal. It wouldn't be perfect. There would still be scars, still be moments of tension, but for the first time in a long time, they could see the light. It was faint, maybe, but it was there. As Jim leaned back in his chair, he realized that the hardest part was over. The family had weathered the storm, and now they could begin again. But even as Jim allowed himself to feel this small victory, a question lingered in the back of his mind. Could the future really be different? The weight of that question, though heavy, no longer felt as suffocating. It was a question for another day. For now, the family was together, and that was enough. The healing, it seemed, was finally beginning. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the park as Jim and Peter walked side by side, their footsteps echoing softly on the gravel path. It was quiet, peaceful even, and the cool air was a welcome change from the heaviness that had clouded their relationship for so long. The distance between them had closed in a way that felt almost surreal, as though they had both been walking toward this moment for years, unknowingly. Jim stole a glance at Peter, seeing the man his son had become, not perfect, but determined, self-sufficient, and ready to face the world on his own terms. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them, but it wasn't the same kind of oppressive weight it had been before. This felt different, lighter almost. There was still pain, still the scar of the past, but it wasn't as sharp as it once was. Finally, Jim broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "You know, Peter, forgiveness isn't easy. It never has been, not for me. It's not something you can just decide to do and expect everything to be fine. It takes time, it takes work, but it's the only way to heal." He paused, looking out at the quiet expanse of the park ahead of them. "I've spent so much of my life holding on to anger, holding on to resentment. And I thought it was keeping me safe. But all it did was keep me from seeing you for who you really are and who you could be." Peter looked at him, his face thoughtful, almost a little surprised at his father's words. He had heard forgiveness before, but never quite like this. Never with the weight of everything that had come before. "I've made mistakes, Dad. I know I've hurt you, hurt Mom. I never wanted to. But I get it now. I get what you were trying to protect me from." His voice cracked, but he pushed through. Thank you for giving me a chance to prove I can do better." Jim nodded slowly, the lump in his throat threatening to make his voice falter. This moment of real, raw honesty between them felt like the real beginning of their healing. For so long, Jim had felt like he was drowning in the mistakes of the past. And for so long, he had carried the weight of Peter's decisions as if they were his own. But now, watching Peter walk beside him, stronger and more aware of who he was, Jim finally understood. He hadn't failed as a father. He had been trying to protect something, his son's future, his family's peace. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the possibility of rebuilding. Now, that possibility was right in front of him. The words of the therapist, the countless hours spent talking through their issues, had brought them here. But it wasn't just therapy. It was the work Peter had done to change, and the work Jim had done to learn to let go of the anger that had once defined him. Together, they were walking towards something better. Not perfect, just better. When they reached the park bench, they sat down, the silence between them comfortable now. Jim took a deep breath, the weight of their shared past settling in his chest. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel burdened by it. "I see the changes in you, Peter, and I see that you're ready to move forward. You've got the strength to do it on your own, and I'm proud of you for that." Peter's eyes softened, and he nodded, looking out across the park as the world continued on around them. "I wouldn't be here without you, Dad. I wouldn't be where I am now if it weren't for the chance you gave me." Jim swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to rise up again, but he kept them in check. This wasn't about dwelling on the past anymore. This was about moving forward, together. The anger, the bitterness, it was all still there in pieces, but it didn't define him anymore. It didn't define them. They had come through the darkest times, and now they had a chance to build something new. As they stood up and started walking again side by side, Jim couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. His son had made strides on his own, his path no longer dependent on Jim's every move. And yet, Jim knew that this wasn't the end of their journey. The road ahead was long, and there would be more challenges. But now, there was trust, there was understanding, and there was love. The kind of love that didn't come with expectations, but with the quiet understanding that they were both enough, just as they were. When they returned home later, Karen was waiting for them, her smile soft and knowing. The family, once fractured and broken by lies and misunderstandings, was beginning to find peace in each other's presence. The simple moments, dinner together, a quiet conversation on the couch, were beginning to feel real again. For the first time in a long time, Jim felt the stirrings of joy in the small things. The healing, though slow, was happening. Peter was becoming the man Jim had always hoped he could be, and Jim, for the first time in years, was truly ready to embrace the future. He knew there would still be challenges, but the worst was behind them. As Jim and Peter shared a brief, understanding look, walking into the future together, Jim realized that the legacy of forgiveness they were building wasn't just for Peter. It was for all of them. Together, they were stronger than they had ever been, and though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, they were ready to face it, side by side,